There is a specific moment in history that is rarely discussed with the depth it deserves. It was a moment when the most formidable empire the world had ever witnessed, an empire that spanned every continent on the globe, commanded the most massive navy ever assembled, controlled the entire flow of international trade, and literally owned 1/4 of the Earth's total landmass, was quietly and systematically replaced by its former colony. This was a nation that, just a single century earlier, had been nothing more than a loose collection of farmers, frontiersmen, and merchants struggling for basic survival on the edge of the known world. The most fascinating aspect of this story is not simply that it occurred, but rather how it occurred. The transfer of global economic supremacy from Great Britain to the United States was not a single, dramatic event. It was not a war that concluded with a simple treaty and a handshake. Instead, it was a slow, grinding, multi-generational process defined by financial maneuvering, industrial brute force, two catastrophic world wars, and some of the most consequential backroom deals ever struck between sovereign nations. By the time Britain fully realized it was no longer the center of the world, it was already too late. The center of gravity had moved 3,000 miles west across the Atlantic to a country that had studied Britain's playbook, improved upon every single page, and then proceeded to rewrite the rules entirely. To understand this, let us go back to the beginning, to a time when Britain stood alone at the summit of the global economy, and a young, restless America was only just beginning to stir. In the middle of the 1800s, the British Empire was not just powerful, it was, by virtually every measurable standard, the most dominant force in human civilization. Its economy served as the engine of the world. Its currency, the pound sterling, was the universal standard of value. Its capital, London, was the financial nerve center of the entire planet, the place where the price of wheat in Argentina, cotton in Egypt, and tea in India was ultimately decided. The city of London, that ancient square mile of banks, brokerages, and insurance firms, processed the vast majority of the world's trade finance. If you wanted to move goods across an ocean, you almost certainly required a letter of credit from a London bank. If you wanted to insure a cargo ship, you went to Lloyd's. If you wanted to raise capital for a railway in South America or a mine in South Africa, you floated your bonds in London. There was simply nowhere else to go. This was not an accident of geography. Britain had earned this position through a century of relentless innovation. It was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, the country that figured out how to harness steam power, mechanize textile production, and build an economy on coal and iron before anyone else even understood what was happening. By 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace, Britain's industrial supremacy seemed completely unassailable. The exhibition itself was a monument to this dominance, a glittering glass palace filled with the finest manufactured goods on earth, almost all of which were British. Visitors from across the world came to marvel at the machinery, the engineering, and the sheer productive power of this small island nation. An American visitor named Benjamin Johnson, while surveying Britain's transportation machinery, wrote that the English display was far more extensive than all the other nations combined, and that the perfection and beauty of the finish was worthy of the highest praise. In the 2 decades following the Crystal Palace, Britain experienced the fastest sustained annual growth in GDP per capita in its entire history, averaging just over 2% per year, which was staggering at the time. Its exports, 2/3 of which were manufactured goods, tripled in volume. The country's merchant marine carried more cargo than every other nation's fleet combined. The Royal Navy, the largest and most technologically advanced in the world, patrolled every ocean, protecting British trade routes and enforcing a global order that served British interests first and foremost. Yet even at this apparent peak, the foundations were already shifting. Across the Atlantic, something enormous was beginning to take shape, something that would ultimately consume Britain's lead, absorb its financial power, and relegate the once mighty empire to the role of a junior partner in someone else's world order. To understand how America rose, you first have to understand what America had that Britain did not. The answer, put simply, was everything in abundance. The sheer physical scale of the United States was almost incomprehensible to Europeans. The landmass was vast, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and it was loaded with natural resources on a scale that dwarfed anything the British Isles could offer. There was coal in Appalachia and Pennsylvania, iron ore in Minnesota's Mesabi Range, oil in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, Oklahoma, and California, copper in Montana and Arizona, timber in the Pacific Northwest, and some of the most fertile agricultural land on the planet running through the Great Plains and the Mississippi River Valley. Britain, by contrast, was a small island. It had coal and iron, yes, but its reserves were finite and increasingly expensive to extract. For almost every other raw material, it depended on imports, often from its colonies, shipped thousands of miles across hostile seas. But raw materials alone do not build an economic superpower. What the United States also had was people, and they were arriving by the millions. Between 1860 and 1900, the population of the United States roughly doubled, surging from around 31 million to over 76 million. Much of this growth came from immigration as waves of people from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, and China poured into American ports, lured by the promise of cheap land, factory work, and a chance to build a new life. This gave the United States something that Britain, with its relatively stable and smaller population, could never match: a rapidly expanding domestic market and a virtually limitless supply of labor. Then there was the land itself. In 1862, the Homestead Act opened up millions of acres of Western territory to settlers, essentially giving away land for free to anyone willing to farm it. This wasn't just a social policy, it was an economic accelerant. It turned the American interior into the most productive agricultural region on the planet, generating enormous surpluses of grain, meat, and cotton that flooded global markets. American wheat undercut European farmers so dramatically that it triggered agricultural crises across the continent. The true catalyst for America's economic explosion, however, was the railroad. In 1869, the first transcontinental railroad was completed, connecting the East Coast to the West Coast and slashing cross-country travel time from 6 months to 6 days. Over the next 3 decades, railroad track mileage tripled, then doubled again. The railroads did more than just move people and goods. They created entirely new markets, linking formerly isolated farming communities and mining towns to the great commercial centers of the East. They spawned new industries, from steel to lumber to meatpacking. They attracted staggering amounts of investment capital, much of it, ironically, from Britain. They enabled a kind of economic integration that the British, spread across dozens of colonies and dependencies, connected only by slow-moving sea routes, could never replicate. The numbers tell a story that is almost shocking in its speed. Between 1865 and 1898, American coal production rose by 800%. Railway track mileage grew by 567%. By the middle of the 1880s, the United States had surpassed Britain as the world's leading producer of manufactured goods and steel. In 1860, American furnaces produced just 13,000 tons of steel. By 1879, that figure had climbed to over 1 million tons per year. By 1900, it was 10 million. And by 1910, the United States was producing over 24 million tons of steel annually, more than Britain and Germany combined. As production scaled up, the price of steel dropped by over 80%, making it cheaper and more accessible, which in turn fueled even more industrial growth in construction, shipbuilding, and eventually the automobile industry. Throughout the last quarter of the 19th century, the American economy grew at a near constant rate of 4% per year, while the leading economies of Europe, including Britain, hovered at around 2%. That 2 percentage point difference, compounded annually over decades, produced an extraordinary result. By 1900, GDP per capita for the average American was roughly $5,000, significantly outpacing the Europeans. Per capita income in the United States was $370 in 1914, compared to Britain in second place at $244, Germany at $184, France at $153, and Italy trailing at just $108. This wasn't just about raw size. American industry was becoming more productive, more innovative, and more efficiently organized than its British counterpart. By 1870, American industry already enjoyed a 50% advantage in labor productivity over British industry. By the eve of the First World War, American manufacturing workers were twice as productive as their British counterparts. This wasn't because Americans worked harder in some simple physical sense. It was because American companies invested aggressively in new technology, new machinery, and new organizational methods. This was the era of Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, Vanderbilt, and Ford, men who built industrial empires on a scale that Britain had never seen. Andrew Carnegie's steel mills adopted the Bessemer process and then improved upon it, producing steel at costs that made British manufacturers look antiquated. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled 90% of American oil refining and pioneered the kind of vertical integration, controlling every step of the supply chain from wellhead to consumer, that would become the template for modern corporate strategy. Henry Ford's assembly line, introduced in 1913, revolutionized manufacturing so thoroughly that it cut the time to build a car from over 12 hours to about 93 minutes. These were not just business achievements, they were structural transformations of how economies could function. Meanwhile, Britain was making what many historians now regard as a series of critical mistakes. While American and German firms were investing heavily in research, development, and technical education, Britain was resting on the methods that had made it great during the First Industrial Revolution. British firms were slow to adopt new technologies like ring spinning in the cotton industry and the automatic loom, innovations that multiplied worker productivity. British education lagged badly behind. While Germany built a world-class system of technical universities and the United States expanded public education on a massive scale, Britain still relied on a haphazard collection of mechanics institutes and a few enlightened grammar schools. As one historian put it, the new technologies of the late 19th century required educated labor, and Britain fell behind both Germany and the United States, both of which had much larger state-financed educational systems. There was also something deeper at play, something cultural and structural. Britain's economy was increasingly oriented toward finance and services rather than manufacturing. The City of London was extraordinarily profitable, and British capital flowed outward into colonial infrastructure, foreign railways, and overseas mines rather than being reinvested in domestic industry. This was rational from the perspective of individual investors seeking the highest returns, but it meant that Britain's manufacturing base was being slowly hollowed out, even as the financial sector boomed. The very thing that made Britain rich, its role as the world's banker and insurer, was quietly undermining the industrial foundation that had made that financial power possible in the first place. In the summer of 1914, the world changed forever, and with it, the balance of economic power between Britain and the United States shifted in ways that could never be reversed. When the First World War erupted in August of 1914, London was still the undisputed financial capital of the world. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Britain was the world's largest creditor nation, with investments spanning every continent. But within 4 years, all of that would be transformed. The immediate financial shock of the war was devastating. In the final week of July 1914, London's foreign exchange and discount markets collapsed. The London Stock Exchange closed on July 31st and stayed shut for 5 months. Panicked investors lined up at the Bank of England, trying to exchange their paper money for gold. The British government responded by effectively abandoning the gold standard, printing £300 million in unbacked treasury notes nicknamed Bradburys after the official whose signature they bore. It was a desperate measure, and it signaled something profound. The financial system that had underpinned a century of British dominance was not as invincible as it appeared. The war consumed resources on a scale that no one had anticipated. Britain's national debt exploded from £650 million in 1914 to £7.7 billion by 1919, an increase of more than tenfold. To finance the war, Britain borrowed heavily, not just from its own citizens through war bonds, but from the United States. The numbers are staggering. The United States lent a total of $7 billion during the war, of which $3.7 billion went directly to Britain. Britain also lent enormous sums to its allies, particularly Russia, Italy, and France, acting as a kind of financial middleman. But the critical difference was that, while Britain was both a massive borrower and a massive lender, the United States was the one entity that never had to seek external financing. America was the backstop of the entire Allied credit system. the lender of last resort in a global conflict. Here is where the financial dynamics became truly consequential. Before the war, Britain had been the world's largest creditor nation. By the end of the war, it had become a debtor. It still held significant overseas investments, but these had been substantially liquidated to pay for the war effort. British investors had been forced to sell off American securities, railway shares, and other foreign assets to raise cash. Meanwhile, the United States, which had been a net debtor before the war, emerged as the world's largest creditor. American banks, particularly the House of Morgan, had channeled billions in loans to the Allied powers. American industry had supplied the Allies with everything from munitions to food to raw materials, and American exports had soared. This was the first great inversion. The financial center of gravity of the world began its slow, grinding migration from London to New York. But it wasn't complete yet. The 1920s saw a kind of strange interregnum, a period where Britain tried desperately to restore its pre-war financial supremacy, while America, not yet ready to accept the responsibilities of global leadership, retreated into isolationism. In 1925, Britain made what many economists now consider one of the most consequential financial mistakes of the 20th century. Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, returned Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate of $4.86 to the pound. The idea was to restore London's prestige as a financial center and to signal that Britain was back to its pre-war strength. But the problem was that the pound was now dramatically overvalued. British exports became more expensive on world markets, making it even harder for British industry to compete with American and German manufacturers. The result was a decade of economic stagnation, high unemployment, and bitter industrial unrest, culminating in the general strike of 1926. Meanwhile, the United States was roaring. The 1920s saw an explosion of consumer spending, technological innovation, and stock market speculation that made America feel invincible. Automobile production surged. Electricity transformed factories and homes. New industries in chemicals, electronics, and aviation emerged. Wall Street became the most dynamic financial market in the world, attracting capital from across the globe. By the end of the decade, the United States was producing nearly half of the world's manufactured goods, and New York had effectively replaced London as the world's most important financial center, even if the British establishment refused to admit it. Then came the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed. Both countries were devastated, but the effects were felt differently. The United States suffered enormously with unemployment, reaching 25% and industrial production falling by nearly half. But America had the resources, the population, and the industrial base to eventually recover. Britain, already weakened by the war and the disastrous return to gold, was hit even harder in relative terms. The country was forced off the gold standard again in 1931, this time permanently. The sterling area, Britain's informal financial empire, began to fragment. Speculative attacks on the pound became a recurring nightmare. And then, just as the world was slowly crawling out of the Depression, an even greater catastrophe struck. The Second World War would finish what the First had started. It would complete the transfer of global economic and political power from Britain to America in the most dramatic and irreversible way imaginable. When war broke out again in 1939, Britain found itself in an almost impossible position. It still maintained a vast empire, but the costs of defending it were enormous. The Royal Navy alone consumed huge resources. At the start of the war, Britain spent its remaining financial reserves buying American weapons and materials under the cash and carry system, which required payment in hard currency. It sold off more of its foreign investments. It exchanged military basing rights for equipment under arrangements like the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. But by 1941, Britain was essentially broke. It could no longer afford to pay cash for the materials it needed to survive. This was the moment that fundamentally sealed the shift in power. President Franklin Roosevelt, recognizing that Britain's survival was essential to American security, devised the Lend-Lease program, one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in modern history. Under Lend-Lease, the United States would supply Britain and the other Allied powers with weapons, food, and materials, not as loans in the traditional sense, but as aid provided on the understanding that it was essential for the defense of the United States itself. The total value of Lend-Lease to Britain was approximately $32 billion, a sum so vast that it is almost impossible to put into contemporary perspective. But Lend-Lease came with strings, both visible and invisible. The program gave the United States extraordinary leverage over British policy and established a dynamic that would define the post-war world. Britain was the junior partner dependent on American generosity. The United States was the arsenal of democracy, the indispensable power without which the Allies could not win. And when they did, it was at a staggering cost to Britain. By 1944, war production constituted 55% of British GDP. Exports had been slashed to almost nothing. The country's overseas investments had been liquidated or pledged as collateral. Britain owed £4.2 billion to foreign creditors. Its industrial base was battered, its cities bombed, its people exhausted. The United States, by contrast, emerged from the war in an incomparably stronger position. No fighting had taken place on American soil. Its cities, factories, and farmland were entirely intact. Its industrial capacity had not been destroyed, but massively expanded. By 1945, the United States was manufacturing more than half of all the produced goods in the world. American exports made up more than one-third of total global exports, and the United States held roughly two-thirds of the world's available gold reserves. Two-thirds. Think about what that means. A single country controlled the vast majority of the world's monetary gold, giving it the power to dictate the terms of the entire post-war financial system. And that is exactly what it did. In July of 1944, as the war was still raging, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The hotel was in disrepair, having been closed for 2 years. Staff were rushed in at the last moment to make beds and serve meals. But behind the shabby furnishings, something monumental was being constructed, a new global financial architecture that would formally transfer monetary hegemony from London to Washington. The negotiations were led by two brilliant economists, John Maynard Keynes representing Britain and Harry Dexter White representing the United States. They had fundamentally different visions. Keynes proposed a world central bank that would issue a politically independent international settlement currency, one that wouldn't give any single country an outsized advantage. White wanted something different. He wanted a system built around the American dollar. Whatever the intellectual merits of Keynes's arguments, White held the trump card. The United States had replaced Britain as the world's dominant economic and financial power. America held more than 60% of the world's gold reserves. Any agreement would have to reflect Washington's preferences, and it did. The system that emerged from Bretton Woods pegged all currencies to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were both headquartered in Washington, not London. The following day, the New York Times reported that the American dollar had obtained international recognition on paper as, in fact, the world currency. For Britain, this was a devastating blow, even if it was dressed up in the language of multilateral cooperation. Bretton Woods codified what the war had already accomplished. The pound sterling, which had been the world's reserve currency for over a century, was formally replaced by the dollar. London was no longer the financial center of the world. That title now belonged to New York. Then, just weeks after the war ended, came another shock. On August 21, 1945, the United States abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. The cancellation came as a devastating blow to the new Labour government of Clement Attlee. Britain was, in the words of Chancellor Hugh Dalton, in an almost desperate plight. The country had virtually no foreign exchange reserves. Its £4.2 billion overseas debt was crushing. Its income from overseas investments and exports had been halved since before the war. The country's most powerful overdraft facility with the world's most powerful nation had been canceled at a stroke. Keynes, now gravely ill and with only months to live, was sent across the Atlantic to negotiate an emergency loan. He reportedly compared Britain's financial situation to its military situation at Dunkirk 5 years earlier. The result was the Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946, in which the United States extended a credit line of $3.75 billion, with Canada contributing another $119 billion. The loans carried 2% annual interest and were to be repaid over 50 years starting in 1950. The final payment was not made until December 31, 2006, more than 60 years after the war ended. But the loan came with a critical condition that would prove humiliating. Britain was required to make the pound sterling freely convertible to the dollar. When it attempted to do so in July of 1947, the result was catastrophic. A massive run on the pound forced Britain to suspend convertibility after just 5 weeks. It was a public demonstration for anyone who still needed convincing that the pound was no longer capable of functioning as a global reserve currency. The age of sterling was over. The age of the dollar had begun. The post-war years made America's dominance even more complete. The Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program, pumped over $13 billion into the reconstruction of Western Europe between 1948 and 1951. That was roughly 3% of the American gross national product and 13% of the federal budget over that period. The results were remarkable. By the end of the program, participating countries' gross national product was one-third higher than when the plan started. Their crippling foreign exchange shortages had been nearly overcome. American exports to Europe surged, and the United States cemented its position as not just the world's largest economy, but the architect and guarantor of the entire Western economic order. Britain received Marshall Plan aid too, but the dynamic was clear. Britain was now a recipient of American generosity, not a peer. It was rebuilding with American money on American terms, within an American-designed financial system. The United States approached the restoration of Western European economies as an investment in the preservation of peace and the protection of markets for American goods. And it worked brilliantly. America didn't just win the war, it won the peace. And it built a global system that would keep it winning for decades to come. If there was a single moment that crystallized Britain's fall from superpower status, it was the Suez Crisis of 1956. What made it so devastating was not the military defeat, because militarily, Britain was actually winning. What made it devastating was that the United States stepped in and forced its oldest ally to back down, demonstrating to the entire world that Britain could no longer act as an independent global power. The crisis began when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in July of 1956. The canal was vital, a 120-mile waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, through which two-thirds of the oil used by Europe flowed. It had been controlled by a British-French company, and its seizure was a direct challenge to European and particularly British power in the Middle East. Britain, France, and Israel launched a secret military operation to take the canal back. It worked militarily, but politically it was a catastrophe. The United States under President Eisenhower was furious. The invasion had been launched without American consultation, and it was happening at the worst possible time, just as the Soviet Union was brutally crushing the Hungarian Revolution, giving the Americans a propaganda opportunity that the Suez fiasco was now undermining. Eisenhower didn't just express displeasure, he applied devastating economic pressure. The United States threatened to sell its holdings of British government bonds, which would have crashed the pound. It blocked British access to IMF emergency funds. It refused to supply oil to replace the disrupted Middle Eastern supplies. Facing economic panic and the very real threat of having to devalue its currency, Britain was forced into a humiliating ceasefire and withdrawal. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, his health and reputation shattered, resigned in January of 1957. The lesson of Suez was brutal and unambiguous. Britain had launched a major military operation, was winning it, and was forced to abandon it because the United States said so. The former colony had not just overtaken the mother country, it had replaced it. Britain was now in the cold calculus of geopolitics, a middle power. It still had nuclear weapons, a seat on the UN Security Council, and a vast, if rapidly shrinking empire. But its independence of action was gone. It could do nothing of consequence on the world stage without American approval. And everyone from Cairo to Moscow to London itself now understood this. What makes this entire story so compelling is that the transfer of power from Britain to America was not a single event, but a process that unfolded over roughly 70 years, from the 1880s to the 1950s. It followed a pattern that is worth understanding because it may be repeating itself today in a different form with a different rising power. The pattern goes something like this. First, the rising power surpasses the incumbent in raw economic output. This happened in the 1870s when the American economy grew larger than Britain's in total GDP. But raw size isn't everything. Britain still had the financial infrastructure, the reserve currency, the colonial network, and the military reach that gave it global primacy. So for decades, there was a gap between economic reality and political reality. America was richer, but Britain still ran the system. Second, a crisis, usually a war, forces the incumbent to borrow from the rising power, creating a dependency that is difficult to reverse. This happened during the First World War. Britain entered the war as the world's largest creditor and exited as a debtor, while the United States made the exact opposite journey. The financial relationship between the two countries was permanently altered. Third, the incumbent tries to restore the old order, but the structural damage is too great. Britain's attempt to return to the gold standard at the pre-war rate in 1925 was precisely this kind of effort, a bid to turn back the clock. It failed and it made things worse. Fourth, a second, even more devastating crisis completes the transition. The Second World War accomplished what the first had started. It drained Britain of its remaining financial reserves, destroyed its industrial capacity, and forced it into a position of total dependence on American support. Bretton Woods, the Anglo-American loan, and the Marshall Plan were the institutional mechanisms through which the transition was formalized. And fifth, a symbolic event makes the new reality undeniable to everyone. Suez was that event for Britain, the moment when the pretense of great power status could no longer be maintained. What is remarkable about this story is how long it took. The United States became the world's largest economy in the 1870s, but the dollar didn't formally replace the pound as the world's reserve currency until 1944, roughly 70 years later. Recognition, it turns out, lags reality by a very long time. Institutions, financial networks, diplomatic relationships, and cultural prestige all have enormous inertia. Britain's financial system, its network of colonial trading relationships, its deep expertise in banking and insurance, these things didn't disappear overnight just because American factories were producing more steel. The old order hung on, propped up by habit, by the absence of a viable alternative, and by Britain's own fierce determination to maintain its position. But ultimately, the fundamentals won. The country with the larger population, the greater natural resources, the higher productivity, the more dynamic industrial base, and the more innovative financial sector eventually assumed the leadership role that its economic weight demanded. It just took decades and two world wars to make it happen. Today, you can trace the lines of this transition through every corner of the modern financial system. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency. The IMF and World Bank are still headquartered in Washington. Wall Street, not the City of London, sets the pace for global capital markets. American Treasury bonds are the bedrock asset of the international financial system, the thing that every central bank on earth holds in its reserves. The institutions created at Bretton Woods, though they have evolved considerably, still reflect the fundamental architecture that American power built in 1944. And Britain, for its part, adapted. It found a new role as America's closest ally, leveraging its diplomatic expertise, its intelligence services, and its cultural influence to maintain a seat at the top table, even if it was no longer the one setting the agenda. The special relationship, as it came to be known, was in many ways a pragmatic acknowledgement of the new reality. If this deep dive into the shifting tides of global power has changed the way you look at the world's economic landscape, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the historical truths that define our present and shape our future. Join us as we continue to explore the hidden forces of history. The next chapter of our journey will begin soon.